Hi, Women of Welcome. I'm Sarah Casada, and I'm really glad that you're joining me here for this conversation with Matthew Soerens. And so we'll see. I have tried to connect with my kids so that they're in another another place. So we'll see if that happens. Oh, I see Matt here, so let's get him to join me. Oh, and I'm glad to see some other folks joining as well. This is a real treat. Oh, hey.
Hey,
Oh,
did I
good.
do this right?
You did. Well, there we go. Yay. We made it work.
And we'll see if
Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm fine. We'll see if my kids are quiet as well. Possible, but not likely.
I know. Well, someone said they would come and pick them up. And so I'm like, please just leave the building, hopefully with the right person. We'll see how it goes. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. We have had lots of questions over the past few weeks just about headlines that we're reading about immigration. And I think this community is really great because we really try to approach with curiosity rather than sort of just immediately jumping to extreme reactions because we genuinely want to learn. And we know that there's different narratives out there for different people who have different reasons for that. And we want to find out from people who are actively working in these spaces, what is going on, what do we need to know, and how can we best advocate and be part of the solution and part of a welcoming and Christ-like culture. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm very happy to join you. Lots happening.
Yes, so let's jump right in. Well, first let me say there's a couple of things we want to talk about so folks who are joining us can kind of know where we're going. We want to talk about unaccompanied minors, kids at the border, what's really happening there. We're hearing some headlines that are a little alarming, and we've talked some about that in this community, but we want to know more. As well as families at the border, our asylum seeking processes. We've heard lots of different things about that, and we want to know what's going on. And then we also want to talk about legislation that we're hearing about, proposed legislation for immigration reform. So thanks for everybody who's joining us. If you have comments, feel free to put those here in the chat, and I will do my best if possible, if I can talk and look and hear and listen all at the same time, but I will try to ask those questions as well. So let's jump right into unaccompanied minors and kids at the border. What can you tell us about that process and how it's changed and is changing again?
Yeah, I think for me what's helpful to think about in terms of unaccompanied children is sort of a continuum of best case scenario to worst case scenario. It's not as simple as is this good or bad. Best case scenario clearly would be a child is with their parents and is safe and secure. Like that's what we all want for our own kids, right? At the far other end of the spectrum would be worst case scenario, a child unaccompanied by themselves is on their own at risk of harm, potentially, turned over to human traffickers who will exploit them and harm them. And I think what's important to know is that that sort of worst case scenario is what was happening with unaccompanied children who reached the U.S.-Mexico border up until a couple months ago, or even just over a month ago. So under I would say the pretext of the coronavirus pandemic, the Trump administration basically suspended elements of U.S. law under something called the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act that govern what should happen to an unaccompanied child. So what should happen is that child is turned over from the Border Patrol that apprehends them, part of the Department of Homeland Security, to the Department of Health and Human Services within 72 hours. And from there, Health and Human Services, which has more experience caring for children than the law enforcement part of our government, is supposed to basically find that child's family if it's possible, or they work with foster families and things like that until they can go to court and determine if they qualify to stay in the United States or not. That's what's supposed to happen.
So let me interrupt you real quick, just because we talked yesterday about the ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement. Is that the same or different than?
Yes. So that's part of Health and Human Services. So really, okay. It's good clarification. So that's the part of Health and Human Services that's supposed to handle this. So under the previous administration, under with a difficult circumstance with the pandemic, they basically said, we're not taking any unaccompanied kids into the country. We're expelling them back over the border. which we raised concerns. I know at World Relief, I know the Women of Welcome community did that. Well, notwithstanding that the pandemic is difficult to deal with, we can't just send unaccompanied kids back over the border when they are very vulnerable. And we were aware of really horrible things happening to children as a result of that policy. Mm. So a better policy than that would be to follow the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. The challenge with that is you have for months not been taking any kids. So now the Biden administration has opened that process up for children, for unaccompanied children, not for families at this point. They're still using something called Title 42 and the coronavirus to say we're not going to take most asylum cases at the border right now, new cases. But we
let's
will.
Go back to that because I have questions about that. But
yes.
I don't want to distract us from the kids first.
Yeah. But they will process unaccompanied kids in compliance, they would say, with the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. What has happened in years past with that challenge is when the numbers go up, they don't necessarily have the capacity within the Office of Refugee Resettlement's network of care providers, which is part of Health and Human Services, to process all the children and basically move them from a temporary setting to hopefully a safe home with either their parent that's in the United States or another relative willing to take them, or if necessary, a foster family. So it can get backed up. And if it gets backed up, they can't turn them over from law enforcement, Border Patrol, to Health and Human Services. And that's where we get what sometimes was called, the kids in cages phenomenon. I mean, you can debate whether that's a cage or not, but what Border Patrol has is lots of metal chain link fence, holding areas, which are not designed for children. And we don't want kids backed up into that situation. So what the Biden administration done is they have opened these large, what they would call surge facilities, run by Health and Human Services, by sort of the more humanitarian part of the federal government that's has some expertise in dealing with children. Although I would note these surge facilities do not necessarily meet the sort of standards that a smaller facility do, and they're not ideal, but they're definitely better than being in the Border Patrol facility for weeks at a time. And they're definitely better than being turned over the border to who knows who in Mexico. So it's not an ideal situation, but there are some reasons for it as well. I mean, with social distancing policies, which we all understand and think are important, you can't put as many kids into a group home setting run by a nonprofit as you could during a normal time. And frankly, under the last administration, the capacity of those shelters was significant. It wasn't increased the way that there was intention to do that, and then that didn't happen for complex political reasons. So,
well, and you made a comment just briefly that with the Biden administration opening up channels for unaccompanied minors, that there are kids that have been waiting, and how that's impacted the surge. I don't know if you can talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, I was asking a friend who works with one of the organizations that cares for children in partnership with Health and Human Services the other day. So why are we seeing this increase in the number of unaccompanied kids? I mean, it's not necessarily like the level we saw a few years ago yet, but it's definitely increasing pretty quickly. And he said, well, there's lots of complex factors for that, right? There's particular dynamics in Honduras in particular, but in other parts of Central America that are driving people out. There are, it's probably true to some extent that people hear, oh, there's a new administration in the United States, things are going to be better for immigrants now, and that might motivate some people to make the trip now. But the biggest factor is basically the border has been completely closed for nearly a year. So all the people who might have come spread out over 12 months now are coming all at once. And there's just not capacity. And again, we're dealing with kids. Like, some of these are very little kids. You can't, well, I don't want kids in a big facility, but I also don't want them just turned back over the border or turned onto the street and hope that someone takes care of them. Like, of course, what you need to do is figure out who is a safe person to take care of this child, ideally their parent, or ideally someone their parents would want them with, another relative who you can run a background check on. But you got to keep them somewhere.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. A couple of years ago, Women of Welcome visited one of the Border Patrol facilities with the chain link fencing and the pods where kids were being kept. And as a mom, it was so blatant and surprising how young some of the kids were. And even watching older kids, almost seeming to parent younger kids in that space was very eye-opening. When we talk about when I think of minor, I kind of think of teenager, but some of what we're talking about when we say minors is literally very young school-age children. And so it is, you're exactly right. There's not necessarily a situation where you want to say, oh, we're going to expel kids across the border, nor do we want to say they can come in and then we'll just hope for the best that they just show up to support.
Yeah. So I think what I would say is it's really important to understand a big surge processing facility from Health and Human Services is not ideal, and I should be not the new standard, but temporary. But it is so much better than those Border Patrol facilities, which, I think the Border Patrol would agree with that. They don't want to take care of kids and be diapering children. Like, they want to enforce the law and apprehend people trying to sneak into the country and certainly keep out anyone trying to do harm. So the problem is that the backup, and part of that is related to the pandemic as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for clarifying that. So for those of you that are just joining us, we're talking with Matt Soerens from World Relief. And we just had a conversation about unaccompanied minors and kids at the border, kids in migrant shelters. But we also want to talk about what's happening with asylum seekers, because there's been, many of us follow the Remain in Mexico policy, also called Migrant Protections Protocol, MPP. It's got a lot of names, but it's all the same thing. And when we heard that was being lifted, there's a real question of, well, what does that mean? Does that mean everyone who's been waiting through that process can now come in? Does it mean anyone who arrives at the border can now come in? There's narratives out there that that's exactly what's happening. Unvetted families are just walking into the United States. So can you give us a little bit of context and clarity about what's happening for those families?
Yeah, so it's really important to make the distinction between those two different categories. So the one is the group of families or single adults who arrived probably more than a year ago at the U.S.-Mexico border, and we're told, you're a part of this Remain in Mexico program. So if you want to request asylum, you can wait in Mexico till it's your turn. And they have been waiting a very long time. And a lot of that basically processing was halted at different points during the pandemic, so that the waits were even extended. And they're in some very dangerous situations at sometimes. I've been in churches on the Mexican side of the border that are hosting dozens and dozens of individuals, of families, while they wait for their court date. So they're doing what we've asked them to do. They're waiting their turn in line. And now what's happening is we're actually slowly bringing them into the country, and by we, the federal government, not all at once, but calling them in groups at particular ports of entry, processing them, and letting them wait inside the United States for their court hearing. Unless they, there's any reason to think that they're a public safety threat. Then they don't let them, then they detain them inside the United States. But if there's no reason
for those in our audience who are maybe not so familiar with our asylum seeking process, I just want to remind everyone that it is a legal process to seek asylum in the United States, and it has to be done on U.S. soil. This is not something they could start from their home country. They start that process when they are on U.S. soil or at a port of entry.
Right.
And so I think that's something that sometimes gets forgotten in this process of this really is the way for them to do it. But it does mean some people have essentially been camping out at the border for, like you said, over a year.
Like, we tell people, go wait your turn in line. People are literally waiting in that line for a very long time in very difficult conditions with a lot of kids involved. And now we're finally letting the line move slowly. In some cases it's 25 cases per day at the different ports of entry. But the goal would be to get through that backlog. But what also is important to know is if you show up today at the U.S.-Mexico border and say, I'd like to request asylum, they are not processing your case. They are still, under the Biden administration, doing what the Trump administration did, beginning, when the pandemic began, which is basically using some old public health rules to say, we're closed for asylum, which I don't want to discount that. The pandemic has upset everything, right? Like, it is hard to know how to respect public health dynamics.
I still can't go to the library, but yeah, I know.
Right, exactly. So it's super difficult. At the same time, our view at World Relief has been, somehow we need to figure out how to continue to protect people who have a legitimate fear of persecution and protect public health. So that's not easy. And I will say, with the MPP cases, the people who've been waiting for a year, they're giving them COVID tests before they bring them into the United States. That public health is still certainly a high concern. But it's also disingenuous to pretend like that is the primary risk for COVID. The reality is, we have COVID in the United States already. They're not bringing COVID in the United States. And there's lots of people who cross over from Mexico coming back on vacation, far more than the number of people we're looking at who are coming in to request asylum. So the relative risk is is not significant, and we can test people and that sort of thing. But
so let me ask you, when someone new is arriving at the border, are they being put in that line, or you're saying they're not processing at all right now?
My understanding is the Biden administration has basically said, stay tuned, we're going to announce a new process, but we're not doing the microprotector protocols anymore. We're not putting you into that line, and we're not taking the asylum cases. So I think we're being, it's fair to not expect everything to change overnight, but that's actually a concern. Like, we have to have an asylum process, or we'll risk doing the dynamics that are the very reason we have asylum laws in the first place, which is to send people back to situations of persecution. I mean, our country has done a lot of wonderful things in helping asylum seekers over the years. We also turned back Jewish people fleeing the rising government of the Nazis. And it was partially that dynamic that is why we have the asylum laws that we have in the first place. So we need to figure out a way to do both, to protect those fleeing persecution, to quickly be able to say to those who actually are not fleeing persecution, we're sympathetic to your plight, but this is not the process for you. And that's part of the challenge. Is it's a mixed bag. I think, I'm sympathetic to pretty much everyone who's made that trip. But the reality is some of them have strong cases for asylum and some of them don't. If you're fleeing extreme poverty, I would flee with my kids if it meant them getting a better life too. But it doesn't qualify you for asylum. But there also are absolutely cases that, I have a friend who's in California now. He was part of one of those caravans that came up a few years ago in the news. He's a youth pastor in Honduras, and the gangs were threatening his life. And he won his asylum case after going through that process, after waiting almost a year in Mexico in the Remain in Mexico process. Wow. And if we miss those cases and send them back, some of them will be killed. And I don't think our country we shouldn't be responsible. We shouldn't be sending people back to be killed. We need to figure out a way to do both, respecting human life, by protecting those fleeing persecution and by protecting public health.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And let me ask you this. So I hear you saying, we're letting in, some ports of entry around 25 people a day, giving COVID tests, different things like that. But there are headlines out there that are saying it's a completely unvetted open border situation. Are there reasons that would lead to that narrative, or is that something that's maybe gotten misconstrued? What have you
I think that's, I don't think you'll hear that from the administration. I don't think you'll hear that from the Border Patrol. The Secretary of Homeland Security said the other day, if you're fleeing persecution, wait, don't come now. Which again, I'm a little uncomfortable with that message because we still have the Statue of Liberty saying, give me your poor, you're tired, you're yearning, you're whatever it is, give me your tired, you're poor, your teeming masses yearning to breathe free. The message of the Biden administration for the moment is not no, but it is wait. And that is a hard message when people are desperate. But I hope that they're working on setting up systems to process people in appropriate ways. It's just not true that people are just pouring over the border. I mean, the reality is they're not being allowed to come in. They're being apprehended in the vast majority of cases if they try to cross unlawfully. And again, most people who are trying to cross unlawfully are not trying to sneak in. They're trying to find the Border Patrol to request asylum. And when they do, at this point, they're being turned back.
Interesting. Yeah, that's something that I think bears repeating throughout, is that really in recent years, many people who do cross the border unlawfully actually seek out Border Patrol and surrender to them to claim asylum. And that's something that is sometimes very strange and unfamiliar to those of us who've never been in that situation or don't live at the border or need to know kind of that process. But it is something that people are trying to navigate, that asylum system that is relatively hard. It's both hard to qualify once you get in it, but in recent years, it's been hard to even really get in the line because of the different policies. So we know that the current administration is having to untangle and figure out new systems for some of these backlogs that you're talking about. But there's also been conversation that they are proposing new systems and new immigration policies. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of changes that the new administration makes at an executive level. That is to say, the White House does this, the Department of Homeland Security does this, they have the authority to do this, they don't need Congress. But there's a lot of other changes that can only happen if Congress takes action. So the big example of that would be anything that requires appropriating money, that is to say, we're going to spend some taxpayer dollars, whether it's on a wall or it's on foreign assistance for Central America that might, make people not feel like they had to leave. That requires Congress. The other thing that only Congress can do is give anyone permanent legal status. So,
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
So what the Biden administration has proposed in terms of legislation is a bill that was then finally introduced in the Senate by Senator Menendez of New Jersey that, it does so many things that we probably don't have time to go through all the things that it would do. Some of the highlights, it does some really important things in terms of helping Central American countries and nonprofits and NGOs in Central America to address the root causes that are compelling a lot of people to migrate, things like extreme poverty, violence, and the impunity that is in some of these countries where violence could persist because there's no chance that, if you go to the police, that the perpetrator of a crime is actually going to be apprehended and prosecuted. Corruption and other levels. So there's some really good things there that I think are really important. What is also there is a legalization process for undocumented immigrants in the United States. So these are not people who arrived today. In fact, explicitly, you can't have arrived very recently to qualify. You have to have already been here when the bill was introduced, and even a little before that, I think. But it would basically be a legalization process. People would come forward. They'd go through a criminal background check. Of course, there's some categories of serious criminal issues that would be excluded. They pay some fees, so this isn't a free pass. But eventually, they would then qualify for permanent legal status, and eventually they could qualify to apply for citizenship. So it'd be an 8-year path to citizenship with a faster process for the category known as dreamers. So those children or adults, usually in most cases, who were brought as children to the United States. So we're not talking about these unaccompanied minors who are arriving today, but people who often have been here 20 years at this point, who were brought as a 6-year-old, and who might currently be protected by DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. So they'd get a faster process than the normal undocumented immigrant who came as an adult. Mm-hmm. That's the proposal. And it does have some border security provisions as well, investing in a lot of technology, things like that. I don't think it's a very useful exercise to spend a lot of time on the details of that legislation because it's a proposal that I think is a really important first step. I'm really encouraged that the president is making this a priority, but proposals from the White House don't get passed by the House and Senate and come back to the White House to be signed into law in the same form. They get debated in the House and the Senate. And sometimes what comes back to the president, if anything, looks very different than what he suggested in the first place. So I think our message at World Relief, and I know our partners with the Evangelical Immigration Table have said, is this is a good first step. Now we need Congress, and especially I think in the Senate this is important because the question is going to be what can get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate to figure out where they can find the agreement and what they can get done. So maybe that's one big bill. Maybe it's taking pieces of this, like Dreamers. There seems to be a lot of agreement that almost all Americans, including most evangelical Christians, say we should let Dreamers, earn the chance to become citizens. In fact, they have already earned it. Let's let them fill out the paperwork and get in that process. So it might be that moves, and we've seen Senator Graham from South Carolina, who's a Republican, and Senator Durbin from my state of Illinois, who's a Democrat, work together to put forward that legislation. It's already been introduced. And for World Relief, if that would pass, we would be thrilled. I mean, we've been pushing for that for decades at this point. It's been...
Yeah, I will never forget a friend of mine who is a dreamer was one time sharing her story, and she just looked at the audience and said, no one wants me to be legal more than I do. Mm-hmm. Like, just this idea of like, I just think so many times we really don't know what that feels like to have no options, no capacity for people to move forward in that way. And the way she said that, and it just really stayed with me all this time of no one wants this for me, no matter how much other people are saying, why don't you do it the right way? Why don't you get legal? She's like, that's what I want more than anything else. Yeah. Yeah. And so it is encouraging to see that there's some movement around that because it's so needed.
Yeah. Well, that's something, I go to a Spanish-speaking church, and I know people who would be directly affected by this. And this situation has been basically festering in our country for so long, and people have been living in incredibly difficult circumstances. The pandemic has made that more challenging because, I got this nice check from the government twice now, and I appreciate that. I'm thankful for it.
Yeah. Oh, I might have lost you, Matt. I hope I'm not talking over you. Let me see.
I can hear you, but...
There you go. Great. Okay, welcome back.
Sorry, so many people have been in such difficult circumstances for so long. And one thing I would say is, Dreamers are sort of that's the easiest thing. There's so much public support. And if that removes as a separate bill, we'd support that at World Relief. If it passes, as part of a bigger package, we'd probably support that as well, depending on what all the other elements are. But I also would say, and I know Women of Welcome has been helping to circulate a sign-on letter that talks about the importance of a bipartisan solution for Dreamers. That's a high priority, but we don't want to just get that done and then say, well, that's all we can hope for. I mean, we fundamentally believe that actually Congress needs to find the bipartisan solution for a broader range of undocumented immigrants. And
I think we've seen over the last few years, really in the last couple of administrations, that executive orders just sort of destabilize some of that process. And what we really need is actual legislation that's permanent so that people can make decisions and figure out their pathways.
And that can only happen, this is, the wisdom of our founding fathers, that can only happen with a bill going through the Senate, which under current rules requires 60 votes, which means Democrats and Republicans getting together and doing something together, or at least some in both parties, and then passing the House of Representatives, and then getting a signature of a president. So, I mean, one thing that we've pushed in the Women of Welcome letter, which we've been encouraging people to sign, says is, let's solve the situation of Dreamers, and we also need that legalization process for other undocumented immigrants. And finding the sweet spot of what can pass, what can get the votes to pass. One way we framed this, and this isn't a new idea, this is what, President Bush supported in 2006 and President Obama and Vice President Biden at the time supported in 2013, would be an earned legalization process for undocumented immigrants who came as adults, where they'd have some elements of a fine that they pay, which helps it. I mean, this is then clearly not amnesty. One of the things we've found in past legislative efforts on this, 2006, 2013, is when a bill gets labeled as amnesty, it's not going to pass very likely. Amnesty is not particularly popular, and I get that. I think that we want to have a way to say the law matters. It's not to say these are bad people, if we're going to have an orderly process, there has to be some penalty for breaking the rules. The same way, I'm currently in violation of, I have some overdue library books that my kids have lost. And I don't think that was a moral failure on my part, but I also don't hold it against the library to pay a fine when, I just fess up and say, there's no way this book is ever going to be found. What do I need to pay? And
People have real questions when it comes to amnesty. It doesn't feel like a sustainable solution because then you have this potential messaging that there's no consequence and that, like you said, we need this orderly system. And so, there's some wisdom in thinking more long term than just simply how do we address people right in this moment, but actually how do we affect the system for more sustainability.
Yeah, and I think that's where what we framed as a restitution-based immigration reform that is distinctly not amnesty, because people would pay a fine, there's a penalty involved, but also is not a more punitive penalty, like you're going to be deported or separated from your family. We really don't want to see that. We've seen enough of that, frankly. And again, I think it's worth noting that happened under the Trump administration. It happened under the Obama administration, too. I mean, in 1 year of the Obama administration, we had more than 90,000 parents of U.S. citizens deported. I mean, family separation has been happening in this country for a long time on different levels. And the only way to solve that, unless we're just going to bury our heads in the sand, is to change the laws and say, okay, what is a penalty that most Americans can get behind? Let's have people pay a fine. And of course, if you also committed super serious, terrible criminal offenses, like you killed someone, you're not going to qualify. But, you've been laying low, a part of your community. Let's have the opportunity for those people to earn permanent legal status and eventually citizenship and be integrated into the American community. And we found we can get the vast majority of white evangelical Christians, and probably non-white evangelical Christians in polls are even more supportive, to get behind that sort of a policy. And I think that's, what we have said, we hope Congress will move on. And so, I mean, last week I had conversations with some congressional offices who are not all on the Republican side excited about the Biden immigration proposal. That's fine, but don't let the answer be no. Let the answer be a counteroffer. Well, what if we change this detail? I mean, I told this to a staffer for a member of Congress. Look, we're a bunch of Christians from different denominations. We know all about minor details causing divisions. That's like the story of Protestantism. But sometimes we can find our way to work together on some things, even if we can't agree at what age someone should be baptized or what is happening when you take communion, right? We might have some fundamental disagreements on some things, but there's also a lot that we can agree on. And, Dreamers is something the vast majority of Americans can agree on. I think the vast majority of senators, frankly, can agree on principle. So they just need to get it done.
And I think, we talked about this in Women of Welcome with the proposal that some evangelical leaders have put forth, is that it doesn't have to be this extreme or that extreme. There can be this third way. that brings people to the table and says, how can we be compassionate while also taking security seriously? How can we, show mercy and welcome while also honoring the law? And to really allow others to pull and say, oh, that's not possible. You have to choose one extreme or the other. That's just not true.
Yeah, it's just, the false dilemmas are really frustrating. Like whenever people on one side or the other are shouting at, well, you want, open borders, or you want to deport everyone. Like the reality is there's very few Americans who think we should have open, unregulated borders. Very, very few. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Also, there's very few Americans who think we should deport everyone. Almost even, that's just a terrible idea economically in addition to on a humanitarian level. But there's a lot of space in the middle where we can say, well, what's a way that we can help people get right with the law that honors the law, that says the law mattered, and here's the process to go through to make it right, and yet also keeps families together and affirms that these people have been a part of our community in most cases for a long time. The average undocumented immigrant has been here 10, 15 years. Often they've got U.S. citizen kids. They're well integrated in a lot of ways, but are not able to integrate through the formal legalization that would allow them to eventually be part of the American story.
Mm-hmm. So what I hear you saying is that Biden has put forth a proposal, but it has a long way to go before there's actually any concrete legislation passed. And some of the high points there are addressing a permanent solution for Dreamers, addressing support in Central America for some of the root causes of migration, and providing a pathway for earned citizenship for undocumented immigrants currently in the States. And so, I think sometimes when we hear, oh, the president put forth legislation, we think, well, that's it. What's changing? And so it's helpful to have that perspective that, oh, this was the first pitch of a very long game we're about to start playing. I've never made a baseball reference before, so I don't know if that was totally right.
It might be tennis more. This is the initial serve, and it wasn't an ace, right? I haven't played tennis in a while, but it's going to go back and forth a bunch of times, and that's the process. And that's where we need American citizens and people who live in this country to engage in the process and say,
that's my exact next question. Tell us how we can be part of moving the ball forward. I need to stop with the sports.
Moving the ball forward on the, okay, like,
I don't know.
Yeah. I think, so signing on to that Women of Welcome letter is a great place to start, to say it's a letter to members of Congress to say we want bipartisan solutions.
That link is in our bio for folks watching this on Instagram. You can sign on to that letter.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And we want that from people everywhere, but especially if you're in one of those states with a senator who's maybe kind of on the fence on this. And so like Texas and North Carolina and, Florida and, there's a handful of those states that are particularly important right now, Kansas, Iowa, but everywhere. Also,
and
frankly,
men can sign it too, right? Because my dad signed it. So I feel like men can sign on to the Women of Welcome letter if they want.
Absolutely. And so we're actually doing this as a joint project. So the World Relief has another version of the letter that is the exact same text, and the Evangelical Congregation Table does as well. So whatever one of those letters you sign, we're going to merge them on the back end and deliver them to Congress. So the letter, and we've had a lot of pastors and leaders sign on too, which is great. So sign on yourself, and if you're a pastor, sign on. And if you're not, think about asking your pastor, again, if they feel uncomfortable with Women of Welcome. Assure them it's not a big deal. They can still sign it, but they can find the same language with the Evangelical Congregation Table as well. And what we plan to do, hopefully in the next few weeks, because we want this to make a difference for the Dreamer conversation that's actively happening right now, is we're going to assemble that letter, put all the signatures together from every state, and send it to the appropriate members of Congress, senators and members of the House, based on where you live. So, and that's why we have to ask your address, things like that. It's not so that we can spam you. It's so that we know who your member of Congress is.
That's great. That's great. And so I would assume too, it's also appropriate to contact our members of Congress and remind them that we want a permanent solution for Dreamers. We want to see bipartisan reform. And just for those who are watching this on Instagram, if you go to our story highlights, we have a whole highlight series on how to call your representative. That's super helpful. It's got a little script in there so that you can take what you're hearing here and just plug and play. It is one of the most intimidating things that is actually very easy that you'll ever you'll ever try.
I mean, it always helps me to know that, like, your senator is not likely to answer the phone. Like, that'd be a great opportunity if he or she does. But probably the person answering the phone, if not an answering machine, is a college student intern who's like 19 years old, and they will lose their internship if they're mean to you. So, like, they will be nice to you. I promise. Their boss may or may not ultimately vote for the legislation, but they will be very polite and courteous and take your message. But it really, I mean, you might think, well, how does talking to an intern help? Well, the intern's job is to calculate at the end of the day, you know, this is what we're getting calls on. This is what your constituents care about. And it's not usually compassionate immigration policies. And if it is, it can make a huge difference. And I will say, the one time we've seen that happen in the last 5 years was when family separation happened in 2018. And the number of phone calls that went into Congress from women and men, but I think actually especially women, a lot of moms who just couldn't handle that our country was doing this to children and their mothers, was incredible. I was on Capitol Hill at the heat of that. I was in offices where the phones were ringing off the hook. And it was only a day or two later that the president signed an executive order, at least mostly blocking that policy. And again, it wasn't even Congress's decision, but those congressional offices were calling over to the White House and saying, you're hurting us politically with this policy. And there's nothing that motivates politicians like, you know, the risk of alienating voters. So they need to know what their constituents think.
We underestimate it. I mean, think about how many times we voted, you know, since we were 18 versus how many times we've called Congress. And actually, most people are not calling Congress. So you get this sort of elevated opportunity to connect with those leaders and say, this is important and we want to see change.
Yeah. And I mean, that's true for everyone, because if, like, just by sticking your hand up and say, well, I'll make a phone call, I'll even just sign on to this letter, you're in like the top probably 10% of Americans who are, you know, to go back to sports analogies, like, they're in the game in terms of American democracy. And I'm not saying to do that, you know, for Republicans or Democrats, like, I could care less which party it is. But to say, as Christians, these are the values that motivate us. And frankly, depending where you live, your representation can be even greater than that in the U.S. Senate. Like, if you happen to be in South Dakota right now, or North Dakota, or Montana, or Wyoming, they get very few phone calls in those Senate offices, because there's just not that many people in those states relative to California or Texas or Illinois. But for people who are in some of those less populated states, or Alaska or Maine, a phone call, I mean, they don't get tons of phone calls. So when they get 3 phone calls, they're paying attention in a way that they might need to get 30 phone calls in Illinois to pay attention on a given issue.
Helpful. Well, Matt, this has been so enlightening. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us live, or if you're watching the replay, I'm glad you stuck through this video. There's so much good information, because we're just being inundated with headlines and rhetoric and questions, and there's just a lot of change. And so we're always trying to figure out what's really happening, what do we need to do, how can we respond? And so this was really, really helpful. So I just want to thank you for your time. And I'm sure we'll be having you back because you always give us so much good information.
Well, I'm happy to do it. We love what you all are doing, and are really encouraged, and World Relief is happy to be a partner with Women of Welcome in all this.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, we'll talk again soon.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
Bye.